Olivia walked slowly along the racks of the huge chain supermarket, looking at the shelves of colorful packages. She came here every day, like she came to work. No, she didn't need a lot of groceries to feed her large family. She didn't have a family at all. So the elderly woman escaped from the unbearable loneliness of her small two-room apartment every evening into the light-filled sales room. It was easier in the warmer months. Sitting on a bench with backyard friends saved her. But winter left no choice, and Olivia loved her excursions to the new supermarket. It was crowded, smelled good, smelled of coffee, and played muted music. And all those products in brightly colored packages, reminiscent of children's toys, pleased her heart, made her smile. The old woman turned a jar of strawberry yogurt in her hands, squinted, trying to read the name and composition, and returned it to the shelf. With her meager pension, she couldn't afford such sour milk. But looking at it was not forbidden. Looking at the reigning abundance on the shelves, she mentally returned to those, already distant times when food had to be obtained. She remembered the long lines at the counters, behind which the saleswomen, assigned to the deficit, were rampant. She remembered the thick gray, almost cardboard paper in which the purchases were wrapped, and smiled at her thoughts. It was a good time. She was raising a daughter at the time. And to please her, Olivia was willing to stand in any line. Thinking about her daughter made her heart race. The woman stopped at a low refrigerator with frozen fish. She leaned heavily on it with her hand. Emma's laughing face came to mind, with a mop of curly red hair, huge gray eyes, a scattering of freckles on her nose and dimples on her cheeks. She was a beautiful girl, she thought sadly, and walked to the bakery counter under the disapproving gaze of the sales clerk. Emma, her only joy in life, grew up a smart girl. She realized early on that work wasn't for her, because you can't earn a good life. So she got involved with a surrogacy organization. Olivia told her it wouldn't do any good. But who listens to mothers in their 20s? If her father were alive, things would be different. But as it is, she couldn't understand how those bastards had dared to bring their firstborn into this. It's going to be okay, Emma laughed, stroking her rounded belly. Her mother shook her head sorrowfully. How are you going to give the baby away? After all, he's been inside you for 9 months, he's your own. He's your own. Emma just waved her hand, and I'm already thinking it's not the baby, it's the good money. It helps. And then came the difficult labor, and there was no way to save Emma. In truth, they didn't try very hard. Her daughter died 3 days after the baby was born of acute peritonitis. The girl was immediately released to her parents. Olivia, of course, was paid nothing. It wasn't her place to deal with that, nor was it her place to deal with the settlement. She buried her daughter and became an orphan. No family. It was as if she'd sunk into a thick molasses and preferred not to come out. It was easier that way. Now she wandered absent-mindedly through the bread department. She needed to buy something. So they wouldn't think she'd come for a walk. I took a roll of Borodinsky. After rummaging in my pocket for small coins, I went to the cash register. I had enough fun for the day, I could go home. I counted out the required amount up front, gave it to the cashier without change, and clenched the rest in my fist. Now she's going to come through the glass doors into the parking lot and see her. Worried the old lady. This young beggar Olivia had spotted on the second day after the supermarket opened, almost a month ago. She had been on her first excursion then and was scrutinizing everything around her. What had caught the older woman's attention was unclear to her. Perhaps her conspicuous youth and the tragedy of her motionless pose. Or maybe it was the way she held the baby so gently and tightly. How did she manage to stoop so low? I don't look like a drunk, the old woman thought as she approached the familiar figure. She put the change she had prepared into a nearby jug and turned to the beggar. "Daughter, aren't you ashamed to ask for alms? My arms and legs are intact. Why don't you work?" The young woman grimaced as she saw several passers-by hurrying past, unable to approach her because of the grandmother blocking the road. "Grandma, thanks for the penny. But go on your way. I need to collect more or I'll be in trouble." The old woman shook her head sorrowfully and hurried away. She didn't want to be annoying and read morals. She decided to help and helped as much as she could. No one cared. Not the police, not the child welfare authorities. Everyone was so used to beggars that no one paid any attention to them. All the way home, the old woman could not get the beggar with the child out of her mind. The gray eyes of the young woman seemed strangely familiar, and the voice. Those intonations she had definitely heard somewhere before. But where? Olivia struggled to remember, straining her memory. Slamming the front door behind her, she kicked off her low, warm boots. She turned on the light and went to the kitchen to get some bread. 15 minutes later she was already drinking hot sweet tea from her favorite cup, eating a piece of Borodinsky bread with a thin slice of sausage. "And hungry she is out there, in this cold," thought the old woman sorrowfully. "What kind of life is this? I don't want to freeze my child." I looked out the window, trying to make out the figure of a young woman from the kitchen, and I froze in fright. The young woman had been pushed rather roughly into the car by two men of unattractive appearance. The old woman rushed to the phone to call the police. But she froze. She didn't want to make things worse. She went back to the window, but the area in front of the store was already empty. She decided to wait until morning. She couldn't see the license plate from this distance anyway. Olivia tossed and turned all night. She wondered if the girl and the baby were all right. Then in the morning, she had a strange dream. Her daughter, Emma, stood at the supermarket door with a baby in her arms. Blue from the cold, her daughter clutched the tiny body tightly to her chest. When Olivia saw them, she rushed to her with a hug. She wanted to cover her, keep her warm. But the frozen Emma didn't react. "I'm not cold, Mommy. Take her." The old woman took the child from her daughter's arms and pulled back the corner of the warm blanket that covered her face. From there, a large doll with a familiar pendant around her neck looked up at her. The old woman shrieked and woke up. She looked around the room. Her gaze stopped on the wall clock hanging across the room. "I slept a long time today. It's already 9 o'clock." She rose quickly and hurried to the window. The girl and the child were in the same place, to the right of the supermarket door. "It's all right," the old woman sighed and crossed herself widely. It was New Year's Eve. A heavy frost was raging outside. The girl had been standing for over an hour. She'll freeze to death before evening, Olivia was afraid. She took out bread and quickly made sandwiches with sausage. She poured sweet tea into a small thermos and went to get dressed. When she saw the old woman hurrying towards her, the beggar was clearly nervous. She covered the bruise on her temple with a warm handkerchief. She pushed away the sandwich bag she had been given. "Yes, what are you doing, Grandma? I won't have enough money today," she cried. "They'll chase me out of the cellar. Where am I going to go with it?" I nodded at the envelope with the baby moving in her hands. But the old woman was not going to give up. She wrenched the child from the beggar's hands with her strength. "Eat. I'm old, I'm sorry too. They will serve, don't be nervous." The girl smiled with her eyes and took the sandwiches. She sat down on a bench nearby and greedily devoured the food. She shoved the bread into her mouth and swallowed, almost without chewing. She choked and coughed, looking anxiously at the child screaming in the stranger's arms. She quickly shoved the last piece into her mouth and poured tea over it. Shaking off the crumbs, she hurried to the old woman. Thank you. Well, get to 7 now, and then we'll be picked up. Olivia looked suspiciously at the beggar. What about the baby? The girl nodded toward the door. They let me feed it in the women's restroom. And I warm myself in the market hall when I'm cold. It's all arranged, don't worry. For the rest of the day the old woman sat at the window, glancing anxiously at the thermometer hanging outside the window. The frost was getting worse. By 5 o'clock in the evening she took some food and went to the supermarket for her daily excursion. Passing by the figure of a young girl, she placed the treat at her feet, slipped some pre-prepared change into a jar, winked conspiratorially, and hurried into the saving warmth of the salesroom. This time she wasn't going to linger. She needed to buy sausage and pickles for the traditional New Year's Olivier. It wouldn't be a fancy dinner, Olivia thought, but she wouldn't have to sit with an empty plate. Little by little, she had already gathered everything she needed for a modest feast in the refrigerator. When she left the store, she didn't see the beggar in the same place. He must be eating somewhere, she realized, smiled and hurried into the house. Now she would cut the appetizers, put the carp in the oven to bake and set the table. Just in case any of the elderly neighbors decided to visit her on New Year's Eve. It was nearing 10 o'clock when Olivia looked out the window again and shuddered at the cold. She wanted to make sure the girl was taken home warm. Glancing up at the cheerful lights glowing in front of the mall's Christmas tree, she froze. A familiar figure was sitting on a bench under a lantern that flooded everything with bright light. Judging by the shuddering shoulders, she was crying bitterly. The woman raced around the house. New Year's Eve is in 2 hours, and the man is freezing under the windows. She threw a warm shawl over her shoulders and ran down the stairs in her slippers. She stopped beside the beggar, catching her breath. Why are you still here? She tried to calm her thundering heart and sank down beside him. The girl raised her tear-stained face. I have nowhere else to go, she said sorrowfully. Grandma. There was hope in the girl's eyes. Please take care of him. She shoved the screaming bag into the old woman's hands. She slid off the bench and slowly walked towards the highway. Olivia's mind went foggy. The young woman's intentions became crystal clear. This was not the way to a happy life. Rising abruptly, she rushed after her. She caught up and turned her around. She pointed toward a 5-story building nearby and handed the child back to her mother. Grabbing the girl's hand, she dragged her after her. Already in the warm room, Olivia took the baby in her arms and began unwrapping her by the heater. What's his name? Olivia nodded at the baby and then stopped, looking at the pendant glimpsed among the clothes. Oliver, the girl followed her gaze. I didn't steal the pendant, don't worry. It's all I have left of my mom. The old woman looked back at the beggar frightened. She shrieked and slumped down in her chair. She would never mistake the locket for anything else, for it was she who had given it to the late Emma. For her 16th birthday, Olivia didn't have much money. So she took the old brooch with the beautiful pendant to the jeweler who had inherited it from her mother. He clicked his tongue for a long time, hesitating to throw away the valuable rarity. He thought of making a pendant out of the pendant. And for the brooch itself he gave the money with which he had bought a gold chain. And there was still money left for a small banquet for his daughter's friends in a cafe. The girl took off her outer clothing and looked at the older woman reluctantly. Can I take a shower? After receiving an affirmative answer, she explained, I hung Oliver around my neck on purpose. I'm off and looked for. While the girl bathed, Olivia drank valerian, so this beggar is her granddaughter. But that can't be. What a twist. Then she laid the fed child on the sofa and seated her guest at the set table. Camila, called the old woman, addressing the confused girl. She raised her eyebrows in surprise. Yes. How do you know? Olivia waved her hand uncertainly. I guess I heard. You eat. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. There was no doubt about it, she had taken in her own granddaughter. After all, that was the name the customers had chosen for Emma's unborn daughter. The girl smiled gratefully, looked at the dishes on display with admiration, and timidly began to eat. The old woman looked at her intently, searching for familiar features. "Tell me, Camilla. What happened to you?" The girl seemed to have been waiting for this question. Without stopping to chew, she spoke confusedly and quickly, as if releasing her soul from a long-accumulated pain. She had lived with her mom and dad until she was 5, she said. She had everything, even her own little pony. Remembering that, Camilla closed her eyes dreamily. Then her parents began to quarrel and soon divorced. The girl stayed with her mother, who one day simply took her to an orphanage and wrote a refusal. Why this happened, Camilla did not understand. She was thrown out of the beautiful and well-fed fairy tale as an unnecessary thing. The girl spent 12 years in an orphanage, and then they were released into adulthood. She was cheated out of the apartment she was supposed to be given and put in a barrack that was being demolished. It was there that she met Henry, a plumber. When he found out that Camilla was pregnant, he simply disappeared. The barrack was demolished and she was allowed to stay in the dilapidated dwelling until she gave birth. After that, it turned out that someone had already occupied her new apartment. The girl didn't know how to get what she wanted. And she couldn't, she had a child in her arms. So she found herself on the street. She started wandering around train stations, begging in the subway. That's where she was spotted by Lucas, who ran a homeless organization. A beautiful beggar with a child should bring good money, he decided. So he offered her a place to live in exchange for the day's alms. She and her son began living in the large basement of a huge apartment building with beggars like themselves. There were a lot of them, cripples and the sick. True, the theater beggars were much more numerous. Theater beggars were those who painted themselves bruises and wounds, put on false humps and pregnant bellies. Excellent actors, they brought the owner good money, unlike Camilla, who did not know how to beg. Days went by day after day. In the morning, the beggars were taken to the points, and in the evening they collected the proceeds. Everything would have been fine, the conditions were bearable. But lately she started to be pressured. They say she doesn't have enough money, and her child is always screaming. She's bothering everyone else. And today they didn't come for her. They left her to her fate. The girl stared sorrowfully at her half-empty plate. "Thank you. I don't know how we would have survived the night." She set her fork aside and yawned into her fist. "Well, be gone in the morning, you bet. I just want to get some sleep." Camilla leaned back in the chair and fell asleep almost instantly. Olivia woke the girl and carried her to the bed. Oliver settled down next to her in the deep armchair. The older woman sat at the New Year's Eve table and grinned at the president making a speech. Of course, she wouldn't let her granddaughter and son go tomorrow or the day after, ever. Let them live with her, it was the right thing to do. When the time came, she would be sure to tell them who she really was. Help her get back on her feet and raise her son. In the meantime, let her settle down and live in normal conditions. She's had enough. Olivia filled a shot glass with tequila and took a sip. "Thank you, New Year's Eve, for the unexpected happiness. Goodbye, loneliness, she has a family again."